So broadly, we understood how a agile project works. So we looked at how the product backlog is created and prioritized, and then we looked at uh, how a typical sprint works. What are the various teams involved in it, and what do they do? How is typically work done using a series of post-it notes. Okay, so today's session we will learn about how do we capture the requirements in that typical sprint, right? So when we pick up a requirement, how do we capture that requirement in a post-it note? Okay, so broadly it has these three components: a description, conversation, and confirmation, right? Uh, the description basically gives you an objective of what the user story is going to accomplish. Okay, so it tells you that as a user, I want to do this, or I am going to accomplish this, so that I can get this benefit. Like, as a registered user, I want to log in so that I can access subscriber-only content. Okay, so it basically is giving you. So this is a template wherein you can define your description for a user story. Okay, or you can just list down who is the user, then what is the goal, and why does he wants to do that. Okay, so go ahead with that description, figure out the title, and then give a small description, right? And the rest of the details would come out in the conversation, right? So the rest of the tab that we use, we generally use the top part of the screen, maybe 1-2 liners for your description. The rest of it is either used to show a wireframe of how the system would look like, or maybe the process flow. So depending on the way you can depict it pictorially and capture the details at a minimum. You don't have to explain it in complete detail. Unlike a use case, here you're just being just enough information to start the work. Okay. So you use either a wireframe here or maybe a process flow, and capture all those details. The back of it, you would capture all the details of how do you confirm that the functionality is delivered, right? So this can even be used as test cases, right? So basically saying that how can you validate that the functionality that we have described in this the description and conversation is working correctly, right? So that is basically your confirmation. So in this example, I'm saying that you can successfully log in, or you could fail to log in. Right? If you're successfully logging in, there are two options. If you tick that remember me, then you use that cookie and then automatically log in. If it is not ticked in, then your user ID password will be validated, and then you log in. Okay, so that's the first step. The second thing is you could either fail. And why would your login fail? When your email address is in correct form, or maybe your username is in unrecognized form, or your password is incorrect, right? Or maybe the service is not available, or the account of expert. So you list down all those conditions, right? So basically, you can test all these conditions during your testing, and then say whether everything is delivered or not, right? So that's how you would go about capturing the user story, right? Now, see, a lot of the projects uses those whiteboard and then the post-it note to track your projects. But of late, there are some tools like Rally which help you in this process, right? So I just wanted to introduce you to that tool. So the process is still the same. You'll create a product backlog. You'll capture the requirement using this user story which you have learned, but using a tool over here, right? So I just wanted to introduce you to that tool. Right? So this small video would help you do that, right? So Rally is one software which is used to manage your Agile projects, right? The Scrum projects. Okay, it helps you do the same thing as a project management tool, right? And specifically for your um, agile projects. So each iteration you can prepare your product backlog or update the product backlog. So typically that would, yeah. So when you're planning for your project or for your sprint, right? So you can, there's a way wherein you can add in your new user stories, right? So it will be a list of all the user stories that that you want to be done in that particular sprint. You can add that, and then you can move them up or down and prioritize them. Okay. So first step, you will create the backlog, and then give them a prioritization. Right? So all we are doing is we are giving them a rank. Right. So if you just move it above, then the rank changes. Right. Then you would capture in the details for each use case. Sorry, user story. Right? Again, it would have the same structure. You'll go through the same structure of a description and conversation and the confirmation. It's all three components of the user story would be delivered over here. The only thing is, rather than use a whiteboard, you are using this software to do it, right? So again, it's not a big deal to use these tools. It's all web-based and very intuitive, right? So you'll have this product backlog wherein you can add them. I'll share these links with you. Maybe 10-15 minutes you spend on it, you will be able to do your work, right? The other thing what I wanted to say is this rally is a bigger thing, right? It's used actually by the Scrum Master and everybody. Now we as a business analyst might use it only for some few things like creating the backlog or creating the user stories. Right? So we need to know that piece of it. Right? So we don't really need to know how to track it or what are the metrics, how do we generate those reports. All that might not be required. Right? So we just need to know how to create the product backlog and then how to capture the details of your description, confirmation, and then the conversation. Right? So you look at all those, capture all those details, and that I think is a good thing. Right? So you can, if you have a wireframe and all, you can just attach that over here as well. Right? So you can browse and then attach documents there. Right? So that's how a typical product backlog is created, and the details are captured. Right? It's a very simple step. Just that if you are using these tools, how you should proceed. I think it's there in that. Right. So that's pretty much of what you need to know about Agile requirements. Right. So about user stories.
So it is a part of project management, right?
The tool what I have showed you, or you're saying the complete?
The Agile methodology.
Now, Agile methodology is a type of SDLC. Like you could have done it using waterfall or iterative. Similarly, Scrum model is one way, right? Now, the difference is that it has a different set of way in which we need to work, right? So earlier, if you are working in a waterfall model, we would first prepare all our requirements first, then only the design would start, right? But like what we looked at in a Scrum model, everything is happening, simultaneously. So within an iteration, while you're working on one requirement, the architect is working on another design, right? So the rules are a little different. The approach is a little different, and so that's where you get advantage onto that time and saving time and cost. Okay.
But who decides what to follow? Like what?
So it's a project manager. So you are not going to decide whether it should be done in an agile or a waterfall and all. Right? So it's just that we are learning all this because you could be asked to work in an agile project, or you could be asked to work in a waterfall model project, right? So we should not be like okay, I don't know how to work in a Scrum model, right? So that's the reason we have learned how a Scrum model works, and specifically we focused on the product backlog of how do we prioritize them by putting them across that whiteboard, and then how do we capture the requirement on that post-it note. So that is what we would do in a Scrum model, right? then there are other participants also who will be doing other things, but this is what is expected out of a business analyst. Okay, so that's the reason we broadly learned about the complete process of a Scrum model and specifically focused on what we would do, which is the product backlog and the user stories. Okay, so for all good reasons, you might not even work on this because this is just upcoming, right? So not all clients might use Scrum model. So again, so look at the job description. Unless they ask for Agile, I don't think they would want to execute any projects that way, because I would say around 5-10% of the clients started widely using this Scrum model, right? Others are still in the initial testing mode, whether we should try this model or not. So they are in that kind of phase. Okay, so there's a very good chance that you might not even use Scrum model, and a lot of your business analyst roles, like the other day Andy was also mentioning, you would just be responding to the change request, right? So that's the primary thing you'll be doing if you are in a support kind of projects, right? So only the change request would come in, and then you'll have to analyze and then help the development team develop, right? Yeah. So, but if you're working on to some end-to-end projects, and that could be implemented in Scrum model, then you could get into this Agile methodologies. But having said that, from an interview perspective, ensure that you prepare all this, because even though while you'll just be doing the change request, you could be asked about all these questions in the interviews. Yeah. So that brings us to the completion of part 4. So what we have done is we looked at how industry works, what do we do as part of the requirements planning, how do we understand the requirements, what are the techniques to understand, and what are all the techniques to document. So we covered all those techniques which could be possibly used to document our requirements in any type of projects. Could be it a waterfall model, iterative model. Most of the times you would use case. Then there are other techniques like process flows, and then your wireframes, then mind maps. All these techniques would be used to additionally give more clarity onto the requirements. In a Scrum model, you would use a user story. So we learned all those techniques to document our requirements. Okay. Now, all these with going to a BRD, we also looked at the structure of a BRD, right? And typically, what do we contribute? What would be technical architects details? We learned all that, right? Now, once the BRD is completed, it goes to the design and development, and you would get into you would start the testing of the application, right? So before we go there, let me cover this topic as well on the requirements communication, a small topic, or rather, let me take it at a later point on along with the enterprise analysis. We can group that together. Let me start the testing topic today, and next session we will complete it. Okay, so I think we will broadly have some 2-3 sessions to complete the course, right? So because these are not like our core activities, right? So we are playing a support role in these rest of them. Your primary topics that you need to review would be part 3 and part 4, right? So specifically part 3, you need to be very clear about how to understand the requirement, and then look at the change request and the BRD structure to see how do you document that. So that's the core topics that you have to review and then be clear about. Okay, so moving on to the next topic on testing. So primarily, testing would be done at 3 levels. Okay, so there would be a unit testing wherein each and every program or module which is written by the technical team, they would review it, right, and test it out. Then you would integrate all those various programs or modules, and then make sure that everything is working correctly. So those integrations between those various programs or modules, we call it as integration testing, and testing that complete end-to-end functionality
would be your system testing. So overall, we combine both of them and then call it as a system and integration testing. So generally, this is done by the QA team from the client, from the vendor side, right? So if, let's say Accenture is implementing a project for Citibank, SIT would be done by Accenture. So once it has ensured that everything is working correctly, it will take it to the customer, right? So the customer would test it again, right, to make sure that whatever requirements he has given in the BRD are working correctly, and he would test all those things as part of the UAT. And once the UAT is completed, then the customer would say, I'm good with this solution, I'll accept this. That is when the operations team would take over the application and give access to the end users, right? So that is the process involved in testing. Okay. Now, so testing is not something like you are given an application and you would start testing it away, right? So there are some steps involved in it, right? So you need to first create a detailed plan of how you are going to execute the testing, and then you have to prepare the test cases, right? So you have first prepare the test cases and then you would execute it. So it's not like you can just start the testing right away, and because you'll not be sure whether you're testing all aspects of the system or not. So a detailed plan needs to be prepared, and then the detailed test cases needs to be prepared, and then only you would actually start executing the testing, right? So that's the steps involved in a testing. Okay, so let's try to put a structure to this overall testing process, and then see what are the levels of testing, and then how do we typically approach a testing of a normal project. Okay. So once the development is completed, the first and foremost testing is the unit testing. Okay. So each and every program, whatever is written, they test it out using by going through the step-by-step logic, what is written, and ensuring that it is adhering to the requirement or the detailed design what is provided to the developers. So for actually doing this unit testing, wherein you are going step by step through the code and understanding and trying to verify whether the logic is written correctly, you need to understand that particular language, programming language, right? So obviously only the developers would be in a position to understand this. So only the development team owns that unit testing, right? Now, most of the projects, the testing team would not understand the technology, right? So they are not experts in a particular technology. They are not, aligned to one technology like Java or .NET or whatever it is, right? So they're not experts in a particular technology. So they will not understand what is written in the program, right? So since you have to actually verify each and every line of the code, so the development team is actually required to perform this task, right? So the first level of testing is owned by the development team. So they would write the program. They would, somebody else maybe in the team could review it and then say, okay, no, this is good, it can be shipped off, right? So that's the first level of testing which happens. So if a application or a system has some 100 programs in it, it could be written by some 10 people, so 10 programmers. Each one would have written 10 programs, right? Each program is looked at individually and then figured out, okay, whether it's working correctly or not, right? So that is the scope of unit testing. Okay. Then what do you do? So you have these 100 programs. Now 100 programs are working perfectly fine. Does that mean that the whole system is working correctly? Might not be. Why? Because the programs have to interact with one another. So input of one, the output of one program could be an input to another program, right? So there needs to be integrations. There need to be interfaces, or they need to talk to each other, right? So there could be issues in this interfacing or integration of these modules as well, right? How do we identify that? That is done using your integration testing. So what you do is you would consolidate all those programs, and then you would look at from a functional point of view whether all that functionality is integrated or not. So I'll take some examples and then explain it later. But for now, just understand that integration testing
brings out all those 100 programs together. It makes it one single system and test whether the system is delivering that functionality. So unless these different programs are talking to one another, it won't work as one single unit. Right? There could be, errors involved with the interfacing. So all that is identified as part of your integration testing. Okay. So then, what do you do is you would do a thorough functional testing. Right? So the complete once you have integrated all those various programs and modules, right, a complete end-to-end functional testing is also done, and all the non-functional requirements that you have committed, all of them are also tested out. Okay, so that forms part of your system testing. Okay, so post that, what do you do is you would take it to the customer. We'll take it to the customer and then say, you know what, I have tested out these programs and the system, and it's working perfectly fine. Now you do one round of testing. You feel that it's meeting all your requirements, then you accept it. Right? So the customer has to do one round of testing again. So he will pick up his BRD. He would look at it and then say, okay, I've given you 20 requirements, 20 use cases. So he'll pick up each functionality and then start testing it. Right? So ideally there would be this process of creating the test cases first, and then you would execute it. So all that would happen, and finally, once the UAT is signed off by the customer, that's where the system is given to the operations team. So if they find some defects, they will send it back to the development team for fixing it, and then they would retest it. So all that process would happen. So these iterations would go on until all those issues and defects are fixed. Okay. So a typical SIT or UAT process would have these 4 steps involved. Yeah, the testing process would have these 4 steps involved in it. Right, so let's understand, right? So why do we need this structure first? Why do we need these 4 steps, and how would we follow it up? Okay. Now pick up a large system, something like let's stick to our mobile banking app, right? Now how do you test it? Right. So let's say there are some 20 programs in that overall mobile banking app. There are some 20 screens, and then a lot of things happening in it, right? So you cannot just say okay, give me the system, I'll just start testing and then complete it in like 1-2 hours. That's not going to happen, right? Because you'll not be clear whether you have tested out everything or not. So it has to be in a much more structured way. So that is where this test process comes into place. So if you are doing a SIT or a UAT, so these are the 4 steps involved in it. First step, you will create a detailed plan, similar to what we did with our requirements. We prepared that work breakdown structure and then came up with a detailed plan, right? Similarly, a test plan is also prepared. It also has a lot of other details also, which we sometimes call it as a test strategy, right? Like who is your testing team? Do they require any training needs? Right? Which environment are you going to test? What is the acceptance criteria? A lot of details are captured. So we'll go through that in detail, right? But that's the first step. You're creating a detailed test strategy document, which has a detailed test plan, like the work breakdown structure and all the details. Then what you do is you would go and start prepare the test cases. Okay, so the test cases would be prepared, and these are usually derived from the use cases, right? So if there is a use case, how do we prepare the test cases from there? What is the structure of it? We'll anyway go through that process in detail. But the next step, what we do is we will first we'll prepare the test cases before we start testing the system, right? Once you have all the test cases, let's say there are some some 500 test cases that you have prepared for your system. Okay, then you'd actually start executing them on a daily basis. Let's say on a daily basis you're executing some 50 test cases. So
your overall UAT could be for 2 weeks, right? So it'll take 2 weeks to complete all those 500 test cases, right? So 10 days, which is 10 working days, so which is 2 weeks. You will complete that as part of the test execution. Now, as part of this process, you will identify some defects, right? So all those defects have to be identified. Then somebody needs to analyze that. So usually, as a business analyst, you would contribute to that analysis. You'll identify where exactly is the defect, right? I'll also talk about how do we, how do we analyze the defect as well, right? And once that defect is analyzed, and if you feel that there is a problem with the code, right, so you'll send it back to the development team and ask it to fix it. Okay. So then, once that first round of iteration is completed, where you have executed all those 500 test cases, and then you have some, let's say, some 20 defects, then you have to conduct a regression testing, which means you basically want to make sure that all those defects identified are fixed, and no new defects have been kept in, right? So that's a that's a process for regression testing, right? So you'll figure that out. No defects are kept in. So a second round of testing also happens. Okay. So once you're clear that all those 20 defects are also fixed and no defects have come in, then the customer would sign off and then say, what, the system works to the specifications and there are no defects in it. Right? So that's where the system is given to the operations team. Okay? So this is how a typical test process would happen. So I'll take some examples and then we'll go through the complete process of how the testing is done. Right? How do you plan for the testing? How do we prepare the test cases, and then how do we execute them as well? Right? But yeah, let's first spend a little more time on what are the various types of testing that we could do on, and what are the input-output which go into each one of the phases. Right? And then we would look at each of these phases and then see the deliverables coming out of each. Okay. Broadly, these three levels of testing, is it clear? Do you understand what unit testing, system testing, and acceptance testing is? Any questions?
I was wondering, what is the role of the BA in the testing process?
Right, so that's a good question. Now, see, most of, if you actually go by the definition or from a standard role of a business analyst, there's not much role of a business analyst to play, right? But if you look at the industry, right, so I'm talking about the certifications or the CBAP and all, right, so they don't focus on testing, right? So a business analyst is purely managing the requirements, there's nothing to do with testing, right? But often the industry would want to, cross-skill the resources, right? Now, they don't want a separate guy for a business analyst and then for a testing. At least, they want to reuse some of those skills or roles that they have for some activities of testing as well. Right? So that's where a business analyst is expected to know a bit of testing. Now, that purely comes from the industry point of view. But if you actually look at a definition or what a business analyst is expected to do, testing is not something which a business analyst should do, right? But it's considered as an advantage. If you say that, I understand the phases of testing and then, how to write test cases and then review them and then analyze the defects, it adds to your advantage, right? So that's the main reason of adding this topic. Otherwise, a business analyst is not expected to, get involved in the testing. Okay. Now, where do you exactly get involved? You get involved in maybe reviewing the test cases. So once the test cases are written by the testing team, you could review that. Then you could analyze the defects. So when the customer raises a defect, right? So you would analyze the defect and then say, okay, this exactly is a problem. Go and fix this, right? You get involved in that. You could get involved in the coordination, right? You're the face of the customer, face of the
the IT company, right? So you would interact with the customer, identify the problems, and then you would handle all those coordination and even reporting. Right? So you'll do the status reporting, saying the uh, the testing is like 20% complete or 30% complete. So so you would support that overall testing process in whatever way you can, right? So now I would say that differs from organization to organization.
Mm-hmm.
So in some cases you will not even get involved. Some cases you could even write test cases, right? So that's purely contextual, depending on what project you get into and what they expect you from you. I think broadly you'll have to look at your job description. If they say that I want these features also, these activities also to be handled by the job, then you'll have to do it, right? So uh, having said that, we are preparing for the worst case, wherein you'll also have to do the test cases and trying to understand. And broadly, we'll focus only on the functional testing, because the rest of them would be tool specific. Like if you want to test the performance testing, or maybe security testing. So they're all some uh, tool specific areas where you would not be able to contribute, right? And it doesn't make sense to learn all that, because both these skill sets are different. A person would not be a BA and then the performance tester, right? So you don't really need to get into the rest of the testing. If at all you get involved, it will only be in the functional testing, right? The testing of the functionality. Why? Because you already have a good understanding of the functionality, so you would be able to provide those insights when you're testing. So that is the reason you get involved in this functional testing. Okay, I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Okay, right. So to summarize, broadly there are 3 levels of testing. Unit testing will never be involved. System and unit testing, system and UAT, system testing and user acceptance testing. We could get involved during the planning, test case preparation, as well as test execution. The kind of involvement would differ from project to project, right? So some projects might not involve you in any of these testing activities. They might just say, you coordinate with the customer, right? So identify the defects and pass it on. And some of them would say, you analyze the defects also, right? So the level of involvement could differ, but we're trying to understand that high-level process of each of those steps, right? When you pick up a UAT, it would typically have these 4 steps, right? So you'll plan, then you'll prepare the test cases, you'll execute it and analyze as well. Okay, so yeah, and then the type of testing could be multiple. Like you're doing a functional testing, then you're doing performance testing. A lot of things that you'll be doing. Now we must be wondering, without looking at the code, how can we test it out, right? So how can we ensure that we can test an application without going through the logic of testing, right? So there is a different way, which is a black box testing, which we also use. Your glass box or white box testing is basically looking at each step of the code and then making sure that it's written correctly, right? So that's your unit testing. Now, black box testing would say is a mechanism wherein you will test based on the input and output. So you know that this is expected out of the system. So if I give you this input, if I give this input to the system, this is the output which is expected, right? So you'll prepare your test cases based on that understanding, and then you would actually check whether the same actual output is equivalent to the expected output. If it is, then the system is working correctly. So in a way, it's a roundabout way of figuring out whether the system is working correctly or not, right? So based on the input and the output which is coming out, I'm checking whether the system is working correctly or not, right? So let me take an example for this and then explain. I think it makes more sense. So let's say there's a small example for multiplying two numbers. Okay. So what are the steps involved in it? First, you will ask him to enter a value of number A, then value of number B. Then step 3, you would multiply them. In step 4, you would print it. Right. So if you are aware of the programming language, you will go step by step, understand this, and then say, okay, the logic is written correctly, so this program is good. Okay, so that is nothing but your white box or glass box testing, right? But most of the time, the testing team will not understand the program, right? So they don't have knowledge about the programming language. So obviously they cannot understand these step 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So even in your case, we as a business analyst are not technically, inclined or technically, knowledgeable. Right? So we don't have a knowledge about the technology in which the programs are developed. Right? So obviously we cannot do these, activities of going step by step and then capturing the details. Right? Now this is called as white box testing or glass box testing, and most of the times this is handled by the development team themselves. Right? Now, what is the other way of testing? The other way of testing is the black box testing, wherein we just depend on the input and output of the of the application, and then figure out, whether the system is written correct, whether the system is working correctly or not. Right? For example, let's say there are two numbers that you're taking here. Right? Now you'll figure out what are all the possible combinations of these possible values for number A. Right? So you could have given a negative number, you could have given a 0, or you could have given a positive number. So any number you pick, it could be one of these things. Right? And similarly for B also, it could be one of these three numbers. Right? Then, if you look at all the possible combinations, you will end up with these 9 combinations, right? Wherein both of them are negative. A is negative and B is positive. And A is negative and B is 0, right? Then A could be 0, and then while A is positive, B could be negative, 0, and positive. Right? So you'll figure out all those possible combinations, and then you'll know what is the expected output. Right? So if both negative numbers are negative, then their multiplication is a positive number. Similarly, if one of them is 0, then expected output is 0. If one of them is negative, then the output is a negative number. So you would have had this logic. So you'll pick up some data which is conforming to those scenarios, and then create this expected output. Like if you have -2 and -3, your expected output should be 6. So you have a list of test cases that you can enter it into the system. You have a set of values that you will enter, and then you would capture the actual output. Right? If the actual output is what you're expecting from the system, right? So then you'd say that the system is working correctly. Right? So you can fairly assume that all my scenarios have been tested out, and the system is giving the right value for all the scenarios. So my system is working. Right? So you'll mark it as pass or fail. Right? So this way, even without knowing what is the logic internally, right? So we have tested out the system. Right? So this is called as a black box testing. So we don't know what is happening inside, but based on the input and then the expected output, and by actually using the system capturing the actual output, we are judging whether that particular system is working correctly or not. Let's quickly understand what goes into the test planning. And tomorrow's session, I'll talk about how to create test cases and how does a typical UAT get executed when you are interacting with the customer and all. Okay, so a test plan defines all these, captures all these activities, right? So what do we need to test? How are we going to test? What are the techniques of types of testing that we're going to do. Are we using any tools? Who are the people who are testing? What are their responsibilities? How do we decide whether the testing is good or not? All these details are covered as part of your test plan document. So usually the QA lead owns up this document. He has to prepare this document, right? So typical plan consists of what to do, right? It comes up with the work breakdown structure, similar to what you have prepared for the requirements. A QA guy would prepare it for the testing, right? You will also identify the people involved, right? So that's another component coming out in your project plan. What techniques do you use? So again, you could use a black box technique or a white box technique, or you could use some tool-based technique. Like if it's a performance testing, then they would have some more techniques, or if it's a security testing, there would be some additional techniques. So you'll figure out all of them and then list it down here, right? And then you have the detailed schedule, right? So day-wise, from this date to this date, you're calculating the duration and the dates, right? And then you'd also capture the details about what is the environment, right? Now, usually there would be a different server which has this for testing of the system, right? Now, there would generally be these three different servers. One server would have uh, the development environment. One is called as a development environment, wherein the programmers would log in and then make changes to the code, right? Then the second server is called as a test server, wherein all the testing happens. So the developers will not have access to that server, so they cannot make any changes to that server, that environment. If something has to be fixed, that has to be done in the development and send it back. I'll take some example and then explain it also on how the process of testing happens in tomorrow's session anyway. Right? And similarly, there would be a production environment which is actually used by the end users. Okay, so a test plan would consist of all these details. It would consist of the scope of testing. So what are all the uh, you know stages of testing, and then what types of testing are we going to do, right? We'll also have that risk management. Similarly, what we do for requirements, we'll do that for testing also. Risk management would be there. You'll identify any training need has to be provided for those testers, because that they'll not know how the system would function and all, right? So they have to first understand that. To understand it, do we need any training requirements? If so, they will provide that training. Then you'll figure out what will be tested, right? So what is the scope of testing, and then what requirements have to be tested and all, right? And what is the overall test strategy, right? So what type of test needs to be done? All those testing scope, and then the approaches will be identified. We'll also say what is the completion criteria. So ideally, you would say when all those test cases which have been created are satisfied, are passed, then you will stop testing, right? Or in some cases, you will resend the code. You will say that the system was not developed correctly, and you figure out there are too many of errors. Then you could say, let's say if 20% of the test cases fail, then I will resend the code. I will not proceed further, because that's too many of defects. Okay. Then if there are any tools which are used for testing, you will identify them. Right? Then the various roles and team members would actually be working on it, and their responsibilities, and in which environment they'll have to work. All that would be covered. Okay. So you'll also have a detailed test plan with all the the work breakdown structure and the scheduling, and come up with a test plan document. And so you also have a test plan document somewhere here. Right. And again, these differ from company to company, right? And the other thing what I wanted to mention is, we are not going to prepare this document, right? Just that there is a document. Be aware that all these details about what type of testing is done, what are the risks involved in it, what is the scope, what are the approaches, what is mandatory or test criteria, entry criteria, right? Then how do you say whether if a test case is pass or fail? What are the deliverables, right? How do you stop the testing and send the code back for review? And the environment, staffing, and training needs, all that would be covered for various types of testing, right? So that would be covered as part of your test plan. Okay, you will not prepare the document, just that you need to be aware of it. Right? So in some cases you might be working on testing as well. So it's always good to understand that there is a test plan document in place. Okay, so then I think we'll skip that point to stop testing. On the test design, how do we write the test cases and how do we execute and analyze the defects? I'll cover it in the next session, right? So this is something which you should know. The rest of it you can still ignore, right? So you should have at least an understanding of what is the test case format, right? How do we write the test cases? And when we review it and analyze the defects, what is the approach we should take? Right? So we cannot send every defect which is raised by the customer as a defect and to the technical team. For all reason, you might know that it's not a problem with the code, right? It's either the person who has tested it, they has done it incorrectly, or maybe there are some data related issues, right? So as a business analyst, you have to approach it methodically and then analyze those defects, right? So that's one thing which we'll cover it in the next session. So that should be good enough for testing, right? Again, we are not getting into the details of testing because we as a business analyst are not expected to know this. At a high level, we're still covering that so that we are aware of what happens in a testing. Okay. So next session we'll complete on to this how to prepare the test cases. And so we have some test case samples here, right? So then we'll look at what all do we, what are all the components of testing, and then how would you execute, what all details you would fill in, and then how does this iteration process of testing happen, right? So between the various environments, we'll look in detail in the next session.